Welcome to today's live training. We are talking about how to move to heal, why movement is the number one safety generator for chronic pain. Also, for those who are new, I'll just take a moment to introduce myself. I'm a trained clinical psychologist and a chronic pain specialist. I've worked for many years with women who have longstanding pain that's complex, pain that just won't go away, just helping them break out of the cycle of flare ups and get back to the things that they love to do. My specialty is in chronic pain as well as the impact of stress on our bodies. I've worked in many settings, VA medical centers, hospitals, private practice, outpatient pain clinics, many settings. And I also like to include a disclaimer that even though I am a trained clinical psychologist, I am not functioning in that capacity here. The information that you're hearing today is just for educational and informational purposes only. But welcome everyone. In today's training, we are going to talk about the one thing that we can do, and I've already spoiled it, movement. That's one of the most powerful safety generators for chronic pain, and what exactly I mean by that. You'll also, for those of you who are new, I'll say that you'll also see me look down from time to time. I'm tracking with my notes. I take notes for these trainings because I know we only have so much time and I want to throw in as much value as possible. I also have a tendency to digress a little bit. It'll help me stay on track. Our time is valuable and I just want to make sure that every minute counts. Let's get started. I want to start off this training today by talking about two things. One of those things is the chronic pain cycle, and the other thing is what do I mean by safety generator? So let's start with the pain cycle, because chronic pain is not just a physical thing. I know that it impacts so many parts of your daily life, and knowing about the very common chronic pain cycle is helpful because it can kind of help us understand the process and the stages that occur over time. And so basically what this cycle looks like is that the onset of pain leads people often to avoid doing certain activities. It sort of hurts to move, so we start to avoid or do less of certain things. What happens when we do that is that it leads or can lead to some physical deconditioning over time. We also know that, and so it might start to hurt when you're doing small everyday activities. You might start to feel more muscle fatigue, more muscle tension over time. That's what I mean by deconditioning. Our body's just not used to doing the amount of activity we could do before. What happens when we start doing that for many people is that the negative mood, the negative thoughts start to creep in a little bit. I can't do anything about this pain. Everything hurts. There's nothing I can do. I'm going to end up in a wheelchair someday. I mean, there are all kinds of thoughts that can start going through people's minds. If you've had any of these negative thoughts related to your pain, you're not alone. Feel free to throw them in the chat because I'm sure you're not the only one that's experienced them. So we hurt, we start to avoid, our body starts to become deconditioned, and then we start to experience negative thoughts and negative mood. And then what happens? Well, then we start to withdraw more. We find ourselves more socially isolated. We find ourselves not wanting to get out and do things, and the withdrawal sort of increases. And as that increases, the sensitivity in your body and the protective response, remember, pain is a protective response from your brain. That protective response happens more easily. Our brain has become hyper protective in response to this cycle that we're in. And when that happens, we start to experience more distress, more pain, and the cycle continues. You know, we see people falling into this cycle pretty easily. I have experienced this cycle. Almost every woman that I have shared this cycle with will nod their head and say, yeah, at some point in my life, I was in that cycle, or right now, I'm right here in that cycle, or I've been in that cycle for 20 years. But they all nod in agreement that they found some version of this cycle show up for them in their lives. And I want to tell you that that is not your fault, because it's our brain's job is to protect us. So to respond to pain with worry, to respond to pain with avoiding something that hurts is totally understandable. This is kind of part of our brain's way of protecting us, is trying to protect us all the time. However, when we start avoiding and when we're isolating, we stop moving, we're replacing a lot of positive chemicals with vigilance, fear, and pain-related stress, and the chemicals that come with that instead. Not surprisingly, we start to see chronic pain impact every aspect of life: routine, social life, career, mental health, physical health, the amount that we move. And over time, the brain becomes practiced at producing that symptom of pain. It becomes overprotective. Everything is more sensitive. It's like I've described this before. It's like a car alarm that has become too sensitive. Now it's going off when someone's standing across the street, nowhere close to breaking into your car. And it's not that helpful anymore. And if anything, it's disrupting your life. But the brain becomes practiced at producing that symptom of pain. It becomes overprotective and it sends messages to the body even when there's no danger present. It's getting what it thinks are danger signals, telling it danger, danger, need to protect, and it's sending a protective signal back down with the experience of pain when there's no danger present or a true reason to do so. And the result is that chronic pain and distress continue to increase. So let's talk a little bit more about what I mean by danger detectors and safety generators. We have receptors all over our bodies, from our feet to our fingertips, all the way through our body. And these receptors sort of act as the eyes of the brain, whose job it is to protect us, which the brain is doing all of the time. It's doing its best. It doesn't always get it right, but it's basically making it's a best guess scenario on what it needs to do based on the information it's getting from these receptors in our body, our environment, our thoughts, everything. And so we have these receptors on our body. They pick up information as the eyes of the brain. They send that information up through our spinal cord, our nervous system, up to our brain, and our brain decides what it is going to do with that signal and what that information means, and it will send a signal back down to the body to protect, and sometimes that results in the experience of pain. And so we can I like to think of how things can sort of turn up or down the volume of that pain that we experience or that message that's getting put back through. Fear of pain is one sort of danger. It adds to sort of that danger perspective for the brain. So fear of pain, I'm fearing doing this activity because it hurts. I fear pain. I fear my flare-ups. And poorly executed activity, doing too much, adding too much physical load when your body hasn't done it in a while, doing too much too soon, too much in one period of time. On top of that, maybe there's some psychological load, but the load is too much and your body is too sensitive to be doing that much. And so fear of pain and poorly executed activity are two things that we know turn on and turn up the volume of pain because they dial up our protective system, and it leads to a situation where flare-ups can occur more constantly, more easily, and everything starts to hurt. This is your body adapting. We call this neuroplasticity. It's where our brain and our nervous system can adapt to the experiences we've had. So if we have repeated experiences with movement that involve fear and that involve flare-ups, that repeated experience is going to send messages to our brain in a way that changes how it responds. This is called neuroplasticity, but this is sort of an example of the dark side of neuroplasticity, like working for the bad. A good example would be like you had a stroke, someone's teaching you how to walk again, and your brain is able to adapt and learn how to walk again, right? So it can go both directions. But when it's working for the bad, when we're seeing the dark side of neuroplasticity with chronic pain, the brain's learning to make pain with less and less activity, with less and less of a trigger. And I have talked to women whose bodies have become so sensitive that they'll say even the feeling of the wind on my neck triggers pain. And then we see sort of different versions of the cycle happen that impacts our those danger messages getting to our brain. So when we try to push through the pain and overdo it, which we know happens for so many reasons. I know many of you here because you're used to being a high achiever, you're used to being productive, you're used to getting your to-do list done and this high level of performance. I know that many of you're used to pleasing people in your lives. I know that there are so many reasons we push through, and we want to show that we can just still be capable and do things. But when we try to push through the pain and we overdo it, we trigger a flare up and then we crash. How many of you have experienced that crash afterwards? And when we try to ignore or beat our pain, pain comes on and we continue to push through until suddenly the pain is so bad and unbearable that we see again the crash, the bust part of that boom bust cycle. And over time, again, the brain is having those experiences with movement that are repeated, and it learns through practice and repetition. And so it starts to create pain more quickly and more easily. We become more sensitive. Your brain's learning to make pain with less and less activity. The same thing happens when we try to avoid pain. The brain learns to make pain earlier and earlier, because when we avoid pain, the natural response is to stop activity when the pain starts. So our brain will just send us the alert even sooner: stop the activity, by having us experience pain. In all of these cases, we see what is the eventual limitations of what you can do, the activities that you enjoy, the things you go out and do for yourself. Um, we find people just kind of avoiding pain or trying to beat pain. And remember, when we're talking about chronic pain, often it's the nervous system and this overprotection of your brain, this overprotective response from your brain that is maintaining it and keeping it going in so many ways. When that's the case, that signal of pain that initially is supposed to mean harm or damage, I touch a hot pan on my stove, and my brain is going to protect me from damage and get me to lift my finger. In that case, in the case of acute pain or acute injury, pain is a sign of damage. But when you've had pain for 6 months or more, often for people, your nervous system is maintaining that pain. And pain doesn't equal damage to the body anymore, because the pain alarm is just going off too soon. Remember, pain is the body's response to what the brain has perceived as threatening. The brain, in many cases, is perceiving, if you've had pain for years and you've had these repeated experiences with movement that are negative, the brain is perceiving a non-threatening activity, something that isn't going to damage you or cause harm, as threatening, and then it reacts by sending signals of pain back to our body, sometimes really intense pain that can feel really acute. That's what I mean by what is a danger receptor, what is a danger message. And so we're getting, with chronic pain, it's sort of not on purpose, it's sort of on accident, we're getting all of these danger messages sent to our brain, and we want to counteract that. So the antidote to that is, what safety messages can we send to our brain? And I have an entire collection of those in my group program, and I even touched on one last week. We introduced you to a little bit of breathing, but I want to talk about another one today, which is using movement to retrain the brain to be less protective and generate pain less. And this probably sounds really crazy when it hurts to move, but I'm going to tell you why this can become the number one most important safety generator for retraining your brain away from pain. So why is movement so good for this? So first, I want to tell you a little bit about joints. Maybe this is going to be annoying, because I'm about to say that motion is lotion, and I know you've heard that 1,000 times in your chronic pain journey. But when we move, there are these specialized tissues in our joints that create a fluid that's similar to a lubricant. This fluid loves movement, and movement makes the joint release this fluid. So movement keeps the cartilage lining of our joints kind of shiny and smooth instead of ragged, basically. It keeps them strong, hard, and movement reminds our bones and joints how to align themselves. Our bones adapt to the forces of our movement, our life, our daily activities. The second thing I want to talk about is muscles and ligaments. So if you think about like a steak, sorry for anyone who's vegan, if you think about a steak, the fibers that run through it in roughly the same direction. And this is because of movement. Movement places force on our tissues, and these forces keep those muscle fibers aligned in a way that's the best way to keep them alive, strong, and healthy. The third thing I want to mention is blood flow. So movement keeps our blood flowing and helps flush out waste, including acid that can build up when we don't move. Acid activates those danger detectors. It's one of the things that can activate them, so we want to flush it out. The fourth thing is that, again, when we talk about movement, we can think about danger detectors, because movement triggers changes in the types of danger detectors that are in and around our muscles. the danger receptors in that area can become more sensitive to muscle activity, but within a few weeks, they can adapt and receptors are sort of swapped for a different type that are not activated by muscle activity. So, what I mean by that is when you start an exercise program, it can sort of feel like everything hurts or maybe just like this soreness, right? We've all experienced that, I know. But within a few weeks of regular paced movement and exercise without overdoing it, exercise can stop hurting. And that's because the musclements, the ligaments, and that danger detective system have adapted to the movement. So you're switching the danger receptors for something that's happier and healthier and more safety generating. This is because the overprotective of our overprotective nervous system and the way the nervous system has adapted to years of pain. That's why there are danger detectors present there. Movement can hurt, but you're safe. And then when we participate in movement in a really intentional, paced way, you will slowly hurt less and less if you progress little by little. And you can do this by planning and pacing movement with a good understanding of sort of the neuroscience behind pain and how to determine your baseline, which is something I talk about in my program a lot. Movement has a really positive effect on that danger detection system. Remember, because we're swapping danger detectors for safety receptors when we are giving our body small doses of positive experiences with movement. And what do I mean by that? So if walking is something that's important to you, movement is one of your values, you want to try to stick with this value. Movement's important to me for so many reasons. It makes me happy, I feel healthier, I can do it with a friend, whatever the reason might be. I want you to take small steps toward that value. And if that small step today is to the end of your living room and back, or to the end of your driveway and back, or to your mailbox and back, it's repeated exposure to these small bits of movement that help the brain have more experiences like that. And it's a way to turn off or turn down the volume on that danger detection overprotective system. The last thing I want to talk about is the chemicals of movement, because movement is one of the best ways for us to release our body's natural analgesic drugs. So, opioids are a drug that people sometimes take for pain, or we might take for acute pain, or maybe you've taken it long term. But our brain actually produces a totally natural version of that drug. It's located in our brain. It can be pumped out all over our body. When our basic systems that keep the body functioning are in a bit of a mess, due to kind of this persistent pain state, movement helps regulate them by encouraging the production of anti-inflammatory molecules that calm down those really sensitive danger detectors and nerves that send out danger messages. So I love thinking about that. I think that's so interesting because most people associate movement with so much pain. When done in a really slow, progressive paced way, we can actually chemically impact our brain and how our body feels. Movement is amazing. It triggers new brain cell growth. It helps you think better, remember better, react better, work faster, play better, socialize better. It's so good for us in so many ways. It's one of the best things that we can do for all of the systems in our body. And so, as I wrap up this live training today, um, the way to move when you have chronic pain is a pretty intentionally paced way. Progress is slow, it's really conscious. We want to avoid flare-ups, and by doing this slow, progressively paced movement, we can simultaneously avoid flare-ups while we're trying to build activity. But flare-ups may be common at the beginning of this progression as we're trying to figure out what is our starting point. So it's important to not get frustrated with yourself. Self-compassion is the antidote to all of this, because none of this is your fault. Remind yourself that the exercise that or the movement that you provided for your brain and your body may have activated the warning system in that moment, but it did not cause damage. And as you progress and you give your brain positive experiences with movement, you can send new information. The threat detection will decrease in sensitivity. You're turning down that volume, and you can do more activity without pain. The other just really quick note that I want to say about movement and exercise is what the research actually says. They've tried to determine what's the best type of movement and exercise for chronic pain. And maybe some come, score a bit higher than others. But what they really find is that the movement that's best for chronic pain is the movement that you do, that you find enjoyable, that brings you joy, and that you can do reliably and consistently, because it's that slow progression, consistent experience, safe experience, positive experience with movement. Remember, your brain loves repetition, it loves practice. That's what it needs. And we can only do that if we like what we're doing, right? If we kind of want to do it a little bit every day. I'd love to hear how this all feels for you. Drop a comment in the chat, whether you're attending live or the replay. And if you're curious about all of this and you want to learn more, because I know I only really touched on this a bit today, I invite you to book a call with me. We can talk about what a program with personalized guidance through some education on this around movement and safety generators, what that would look like for you, and how my coaching program might help you achieve your goals or get back to the things that are most important to you, that you value. But thank you for joining me today. I look forward to connecting with you on a personal call. But until next time, be kind to yourselves. Keep moving forward. Okay, I have a question. For someone like me that's super active with a lot of movement yet still has chronic pain, is frequency most important or dialing up intensity? What would you say is the more important to dialing down pain? The two most important pieces is understanding what your baseline is, your actual true baseline, and understanding what an actual true flare-up is, and then taking that baseline. And I think a lot of people, for many reasons, think their baseline is actually a bit higher than it is, like however many minutes you think you can walk before pain will interfere. So really accurately identifying the baseline of activity that you can do with little to no pain. Soreness is okay, but without triggering a flare-up, pain that's, like very intense, it feels acute, lasts for hours to days to weeks. And so starting with that baseline, and there's a really specific way to pace and build it up. I think for a lot of people, there are things that interfere with that process that keeps that boom bust cycle going. That is like a tendency to accidentally push through, even when we think we're not, or we're trying not to. The fact that we have things in our lives and we don't always have time to pace. And so because of that, especially for, like, I remember when I had two really little kids. I had two kids under the age of 2 and some chronic pain. And I remember thinking about, it was so hard to pace back then. And so I think that when I could intentionally apply the principles on most days, I could see my body, even though I couldn't do it every day and I couldn't do it perfectly, because some days you just have to push through because there's a lot to do. And the holidays are a great example of that. But if I could apply this pacing on most days, I could see my body over time become less and less sensitive. And I think it's important to be kind of, so frequency is important as long as the frequency is small, repeated, positive exposure to movement. And then the pace at which we dial it up is also important, because if you dial it up too fast, you're going to flare up your pain. So maybe even doing that slower than you think you need to. Yeah, and so movement can mean a lot of things. And I think that's where, sort of a conversation about what movement looks like for you. Movement does not have to be exercise to give your brain positive exposure to that and use it as a safety generator. And again, it's about determining what the baseline is for a certain activity and learning how to intentionally pace that to avoid flare-ups. And so I think some of that is more of a personalized conversation, a personalized approach of, like, how do I personally figure out what my baseline is and how pacing works for me? And that is something that I help women with all the time. The other piece of this, everyone, is you always want to have a conversation with your doctor on whether movement is safe for you. I would always do this when I was working at a hospital. I was always reach out to the client's primary care provider to say, basically, for liability purposes, right? But also basically to say, you know, is movement safe for this person? And if not, what do you recommend to help them move their body? Because we have to move our body in some way in order to help recover from pain. And I would say that 95% of the time, the doctor would say they are safe to move, safe for a walking program, whatever, it's safe for yoga, whatever they like to do, they are safe to move, if you can help them figure out how to do that in a slow, progressive way. I would say 1% of the time, the doctor said, they are not safe to move. This is an acute pain situation. And that's when I don't work with someone that's outside of my scope of practice. And then the other percentage of the time, it was sort of like, well, it might be better if they start in the water, or, well, it might be better if they start with laying down movement. And so movement is such a spectrum that looks different for everybody. And it doesn't have to be what we think about as, quote, exercise, that we can actually start somewhere else. And again, this might be more of a personalized conversation about how movement can be a safety generator for you specifically. Um, so again, if you're thinking of adding movement to your life, just check in with your doctor if you haven't already and get the go ahead. Because I am not a physician, so you will always want to make sure that you're talking to your doctor about any new or changing exercise programs. Okay, everyone, I hope that was helpful. I'm so looking forward to talking to you in 2 weeks. Until then, again, be kind to yourselves, keep moving forward.